record the announcements. So the first announcement is just that the next meeting will be on Tuesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. So all of our meetings are the second Tuesday of each month. So that happens to be March 9th for next month. All the meetings are at 7 p.m. The speaker will be Dr. Ivan Schwab from the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, and he'll be giving a talk about the avian eye. So kind of the mechanics and optics and physiology of the eyes of a bird. So that's pretty cool. And we're excited for that. Our biannual newsletter just came out, so that's exciting. It is online right now on our website, and I think it's in the process currently of printing and mailing to everyone. So if you're a member of the Mountaineer Audubon, you should be getting that in your mailboxes in a week or so, or sometime this month. I think I can add the link. So like I said, it is online. So yes, okay. So I just posted the link to the PDF in the chat. So if you haven't received it and you want to look at it now, or if you're not a member, feel free to look at it online. And it has all of our upcoming programs and upcoming field trips and events, as well as some cool, interesting articles. So be sure to check that out. Let's see. And then speaking of field trips, our next spring field trip is going to be Saturday, March 13th. So this is our Sheet Lake Spring Waterfowl trip led by Derek Courtney. If you haven't been on a waterfowl bird walk at Sheet Lake before, it's very accessible. It's aimed for beginner level birders and anyone really who enjoys looking at waterfowl. And we'll be sending out an email and Facebook posts with more details early next month. So keep an eye out for that. And then you can check out the rest of our upcoming spring field trips and events in our newsletter. So like I said, I just posted the link in the chat. So we have a whole list that Katie put together. The next one is March 13th, and then all of the others are past that date. So later in March, April, and some over the summer. And we are, everything is adhering to social distancing guidelines. So we are asking people to wear masks, keep socially distanced, 6 feet apart, drive in their own cars, don't carpool. So we are asking people to take precautions. And then the final thing is, like I've said, if you are a part of our chapter, you'll be mailed a newsletter. If you're not and you want to receive the newsletter and you want to be a part of our chapter officially, you can join through the National Audubon Society. And we have a specific link that will allow you to be credited to our chapter. So I'll add that to the chat as well. So if you follow that link, you'll automatically be added as a member of our chapter. And you'd be a member of the National Audubon Society. So that's all the announcements I had. Do any of the officers have anything else that I'm missing that I forgot? It doesn't seem like it. Okay, so for our presentation, just a reminder that everyone's going to be muted during the presentation. We do ask that you hold your questions until the end. So after the presentation's over, the way we'll handle the questions, you can either write it in the chat box and I can read it to Kelly, or you can write in the chat box that you want to ask your question in person, and then I can unmute you, or I can invite you to unmute. So you can either write the question or ask it in person, but all of that will be facilitated through the chat box. And we do ask that you just hold it to the end. So our speaker for tonight is Kelly Sorenson, and he has dedicated his career towards saving endangered species in the wild. So his work includes peregrine falcons, bald eagles, and California condors. Since 2003, Kelly has been the executive director of the Ventana Wildlife Society, working with California Condor conservation efforts in Central California. So we are super delighted that he accepted our invitation to speak to our chapter this evening. So thanks, Kelly, and feel free to start your presentation and screen share. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I only have 152 slides, so I think we'll be done by about 9:30. Hope that's okay. No, just kidding. I'll be as quick as possible, but I'm super excited to be here because Morgantown is my old stomping ground. It's where I grew up, and WVU is my alma mater. And it was just so fun, even just in these last few minutes, looking at the comments and seeing places like Caneen Valley and Cheat Lake, which is where I grew up. So it just brought back lots of very positive memories. So anyway, thanks again for having me. I put together a presentation on our work to restore the California Condor to the wild, and our focus is primarily in Central California. I just want to make sure you can see my presentation. I'm trying to make it full screen at the moment. Okay. There we go. Everybody see that with a nod? Okay, yep. Great. So again, I mentioned that our focus at Ventana Wildlife Society is on the coast. This is a unique aspect of the California Condors recovery effort. And Big Sur is just an amazing coastline. It's still incredibly remote and wild. And I'm excited to show you some more pictures of that. But first, I mentioned my West Virginia roots. The photo on the left is actually on my wall here in the office. And this is of Annie, a red-tailed hawk that I used to take around to classrooms when I volunteered for the West Virginia Raptor Rehabilitation Center. And now I understand there's two other facilities, one of them being Katie's group, the Avian Conservation Conservancy of Appalachia and I guess Three Rivers. And those groups, I think, are just critical for helping generate the next generation of conservation stewards. At least for me, this is where I fell in love with this work. This is where I fell in love with birds of prey. The photo on the right, I'm holding a peregrine falcon on North Fork Mountain when I was 21 years old, reintroducing peregrines there. And Jack Wallace in the foreground, who some of you might know, works for the Department of Natural Resources. Just love West Virginia. I love what it has done for me, because I think back and a lot of who I became was formulated in those years when I was in West Virginia. So the reason why I came to California was the organization was starting a bald eagle recovery program. And I had a real fascination with eagles. When I was still an undergrad at WVU, I created a volunteer network, and we went out looking for bald eagles, and that was just extremely rewarding, and I guess gave me a little bit of a leg up when I applied for the work out here in California. At the time, we had no breeding pairs. Our goal was four for the Central California region, basically extending from San Francisco south of Monterey and into San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara counties. In this coastal region, we had a goal of 4 breeding pairs. And by 2012, when we stopped our monitoring here in California, we had 26. So it's just an incredibly successful project, and it was an honor to be a part of that. But that's what brought me out to California in the first place. And then right as we were wrapping up this project, we had an opportunity to start the California Condor project. Ventana Wildlife Society was started in 1982 Our mission is to conserve native wildlife and their habitats, and we do that primarily focusing on science, education, and collaboration. There's plenty of groups that are doing advocacy. We didn't feel that we needed to be in that space, so we've really focused more on the boots on the ground, direct hands-on recovery. In fact, we still remain the only nonprofit in California that's releasing condors to the wild and working with a lot of other recovery partners. Before COVID hit, we had a very robust youth education program, taking 1,200 youth per year into the outdoors, again, to create the next generation of stewards. We started using live cameras and GPS technology on the condors and things like that, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a little bit. But the bald eagle recovery work led to an invitation with the condor work. We also do some species consultation, but it's really a small portion of what we do. We're still fairly small nonprofit. Our operating budget is 1.2 million. It's primarily supported by foundations, individuals, and government. We operate 501c3, so I have a board that I answer to. Most of our budget goes to our condor recovery work. This past year was 720,000 out of that 1.2 million. We have 2 wildlife sanctuaries that help us. One of them in Big Sur is the real cornerstone of our recovery project with condors. And then if you're ever out in California and you want to come visit me, hopefully it'll be after COVID, and our Discovery Center at Andrew Malera State Park will be open, and you can pop in and say hi there. I mentioned we have lots and lots of partners. So we work closely with zoos that are raising condors in captivity. And of course, we have government, Fish and Wildlife Service, federal, and other NGO partners like Peregrine Fund that's releasing condors in Arizona. If we look big picture, where are condors today? We really have them in these 5 different release sites. Ventana Wilderness, this area that we're in here in Central California, is called the Ventana Wilderness, hence our name, Ventana Wildlife Society. We started in 1997. Then we started working with Pinnacles National Monument, which has become a national park since. This Bitter Creek release site is managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Baja California site is run by the Baja government, along with San Diego Zoo Global. And then the Arizona Utah population is managed by the Peregrine Fund. So that's, and just to mention too, we almost lost this species. It got down to 22 birds in 1982, just incredibly low. And by 1987, they were all brought into captivity for the last ditch effort of recovering this species. Unfortunately, they bred very well in captivity. In 1988, 1 year after all being brought into captivity, they were already producing. But let me tell you a little bit about the birds. You probably know this, being an Audubon crowd, but just to make sure, condors are unique because they're extremely long-lived. We know that they can live well over 50 years. They're also extremely social. We've described them as social as wolves and primates. They're so social that when we tell the stories of these birds, it oftentimes sounds like we're talking about a soap opera or something. It's really hilarious because these birds are incredibly social and gregarious. So they only lay 1 egg at a time. It takes about 54 days to incubate that egg. The chick hatches. It remains in the nest for 6 months. And then after fledging, the parents are still caring for that chick for another 6 months. So you add all that up, it takes about 1.5 years to raise 1 chick. Now, granted, the breeding rate is not the problem though. Humans reproduce slower than condors do, and we've got what, 8 or 9 billion of us. So Obviously, that's not the issue. And for condors, it's obviously mortality. That's been the number one problem all along. So when we got our start, we got that invitation way back when, after finishing up the bald eagle work. And we thought, okay, what are we going to do here? There's no book, there's no manual. We needed to come up with rearing strategies that would work. We need to come up with release techniques that would work. And then we also need to be able to monitor the birds, of course. Once they start dying, we need to figure out what those causes are so that we could hopefully remedy those. And then once they start to breed, because they're going to breed at about 8 or 9 years of age at first breeding, then we needed to monitor that. And then hopefully at the end of the day, we solve all the problems and we look back and we say, okay, let's move on to the next species. And this will be a great stopping point, because when I went to WVU, Dr. Samuels was still there and Dr. Whitmore was still there. Whitmore was my ornithology teacher, but Dr. Samuel, I'll never forget. Still to this day, it's burned in my mind, because I was sitting in his class and the top of the Condor came up, and he said something about, it having no chance, essentially, that its day was long gone. And of course, I didn't know at that time I was going to work with the Condor later. And when I had the opportunity, I remembered him saying that. And I remember thinking to myself, am I nuts for even trying this? But I sure am glad that I did, because I'll tell you a little bit more about why I'm very positive and very optimistic today. Years later, he contacted me, by the way. It was pretty cool. So anyway, we got our start in 1997. We only had 4 birds to release, and the way they were raised in captivity, they were pretty much imprinted on people, and that first release was a disaster. We had condors hopping onto people's desks in their offices. I caught one condor by hand in their garage. These birds were just not suited for the wild. So we went back to the drawing board, worked closely with the zoos, devised a mentoring system by which all young condors are raised in the presence of adults, and all of a sudden the results were dramatically improved behaviorally. So that was a big hurdle early on. After resolving those techniques, we reached out to Pinnacles National Park, which is just one mountain range over from the Big Sur coast. And we got their release site started, and they continue to release and manage condors today. And we co-manage the flock here in Central California with them. And our first release, our first nesting, occurred in 2006. Just to show you a little bit about what the habitat looks like, it's pretty amazing. When I first came here from West Virginia, I was blown away to see, these magnificent redwood forests. You have the coastline that just goes from 5,100 feet is the peak, the highest peak on the coast, and only 3 miles away it goes down to the ocean. So you have this really, really dramatic, beautiful, rugged coastline. Of course, that bodes well for the birds because they forage on dead sea mammals and things that wash up on the coast. I probably did not mention earlier, but condors are obligate scavengers, so they're not going to be taking any live prey. And then just one mountain range over, about 30 to 40 miles away, the habitat is completely different. Pinnacles National Park boasts these beautiful rock formations which serve as nesting habitat today. And it's surrounded by these big, huge 10, 20,000 acre cattle ranches where people are managing varmints on these ranches, as well as cow-calf operations, which provides quite a bit of food resources for the condors. So we still have plenty of habitat, and I really think there's plenty of nest sites in this region for many decades to come that really it's not a habitat issue. Now, maybe we fast forward hundreds of years, things change a bit, but in the foreseeable future, that's not my concern. the habitat here is really outstanding in many, many ways. So to get into a little bit more about our release techniques, our first release I told you about, it was kind of a disaster, and we needed to figure out a new way of doing business. That first release was just a tiny little box, and after the birds came out of the box, we tore it down and then we hid it from the birds essentially. Well, what we discovered was there was no way to retrap and manage, and we didn't realize how much more ongoing work there would be to get this flock established. And so we asked for permission to build a large facility that includes a flight pen. We also have this mimic power pole, which, believe it or not, when they land on top of it, they get a mild shock. It teaches them to avoid landing on power poles, and it works incredibly well, presumably because these are very long-lived, intelligent birds. Then we also realized we needed a way to re-trap the birds. So we built this little double door trap, we call it. You have to have a biologist inside. Essentially, it's a walk-in trap. And you have to have a biologist ready to pull the cables shut to re-trap the birds after they walk inside. Pinnacle's pen looks very much similar. We designed it to function much the same way. And then, of course, after they're re-trapped, whether it's to replace a transmitter, take a blood sample, health exam, whatever it is, then they're just re-released by hand. The radio transmitters are absolutely essential. The only way we can attach these on condors safely is by the patagium. You cannot put transmitters on their legs because they defecate on their legs to cool off, called urohydrosis. And that would be really, really nasty if it built up around a leg band. So that is taboo. You can't do a backpack because they have a giant crop that can hold 3 pounds of meat at a time. So you can't make an adjustable backpack harness. So the only thing that remains viable is a patagial transmitter. So that limits the weight quite a bit. But because we have such a big bodied animal here, we're talking about a 9.5-foot wingspan and weigh up to around 25 pounds. A little 40 or 50 gram transmitter is barely noticeable by the birds. And beginning in 2003, we were able to put GPS transmitters on condors because the technology had come down small enough to finally enable that on big birds like this. And we've been monitoring the flock with GPS ever since, and now have a database of somewhere around 8 million data points. In fact, a couple of our recent field biologists, Darren Gross and Evan McReef, just came from WVU working with Jonathan Hall and worked with that GPS data for a lot of their work. We're glad to have them out here in California. Sorry we stole them away from you, by the way. So the GPS and other radio telemetry, as I mentioned, is critical so we can monitor survival, document feedings, track their movements, locate nests. And in fact, we put the GPS on the breeding aged adults as a priority for the most part. We do have GPS on the whole entire flock age hierarchy, but it is skewed toward the adults because they're the most valuable. And so they're the ones we really want to keep track of. In Big Sur, because condors feed on marine mammals and things that wash up on the coast, there was a concern about eggshell thinning, because eggshell thinning, which the primary culprit has been determined to be DDE, which is the breakdown product of DDT. And it caused widespread failure in a lot of different species all over the world. And peregrine falcon and bald eagle are two notable species here in North America. So we thought, okay, there's a lot of marine contaminants still out there in the ecosystem. Maybe condors are experiencing that. So we did two separate studies, 5 years in length each. The first one we published in 2013. And at that time, we did discover that condor eggshells are slightly thinned, and it was causing a slight depressing of, or lowering of reproductive success, but only slightly. So then we waited some time to go by, and then we repeated the study, and we're getting ready to submit that manuscript. And that one paints a much rosier picture, because when we compare the reproductive results in Central California to Southern California, where they don't have a marine mammal influence and their eggshells are perfectly normal, the overall outcome is the same. So there's really no difference in the number of chicks that are being produced, even though the big star eggshells are slightly thinned. So that was some fun science that we have been on, leading here on the coast. But I say fun science because it's not a major limiting factor. It's something we can publish and then move on. California sea lions are the most commonly naturally procured item that the condors feed on. There's numerous spots along the coast where they haul out in huge numbers, and it's common to have a carcass there. So sea lions, they also feed on anything from whales to as small as ground squirrels. We've documented condors feeding on 26 different species of mammals, including Rizzo's dolphins and all kinds of interesting things like that. California sea otter, southern sea otter. This whale carcass fed the entire flock for about 3 months when they found it. And, at first we thought, how in the world could they even feed on something so putrid? And I'm like, oh yeah, they're condors, number one. Number two is when these large carcasses wash up on the beach, it's almost like a little refrigerator there, and they stay pretty cool. So anytime a whale washes up, the condors are fat and happy. Now, of course, they're always feeding on game animals too, and a lot of the carrion that they find are hunter shot, or at least ammunition shot. In nesting here in Central California, we have redwoods. It's the southern extent of the redwood population, and they often nest in these giant cavities high up in the redwood tree. This one is 180 feet up. And we actually had a biologist, former WVU biologist, I'll add, climb in, and his name's Joe Burnett, climbed into that nest this year, or this was in 2008, and a wildfire burned through, and the chick actually survived. So redwoods are pretty amazing. They're kind of built to withstand fire, especially if a nest cavity is so high up in the tree like that. Condors also nest in caves. In Central California, it's about a 50-50 split. Sometimes just a ledge. These nests always scare the heck out of me, because when they're 0 to 30 days old, but this is about a 30-day-old chick, they're pretty vulnerable. Even ravens could take a 2-week-old chick, and so I always like to see them in some kind of a cavity, not just out exposed on a ledge. But this chick fledged fine, so whatever works. The lead poisoning is our biggest problem by far. There's just nothing that even comes close. And in 2012, we had an aha moment. I mean, we already knew it was lead from ammunition. We collaborated with quite a few people looking at stable lead isotopes, and lots of different, studying how lead fragments occur in animals when they're shot, and collaborating with lots of different studies. But this lead bullet from a 22 caliber was removed from this condor number 318 that died in 2012. You can see it's in this GI tract in this X-ray. This was kind of the big aha moment, because right around the same time, our field biologists were also reporting a lot of observations of condors feeding on ground squirrels on inland ranches when they were out shooting literally hundreds of ground squirrels per day. And it wouldn't even surprise me one bit because of condors being able to learn how to avoid power poles, for example, by getting a mild shock, that they're also smart enough to hear 22 gunshots by the hundreds and maybe connect the dots and realize, oh, maybe that's food. So it could even be a Pavlovian kind of a thing where when these shooting events take place, it actually attracts scavengers into the area. I can't say I have evidence that can prove that, but it's a hunch. But anyway, regardless of whether or not the gunshots are cluing them in, we have direct evidence of condors feeding on ground squirrels that were shot with lead bullets. And then you find a lead bullet in the GI of a condor, you really connect the dots. So what and I mentioned too, fragmentation is a big problem. You don't have to just swallow a whole bullet to die from lead poisoning. If you're any biological animal, by the way, it's not like condors are more susceptible to lead poisoning than any other bird. That's really not the case. It's just that condors are obligate scavengers, so they only eat the remains of dead animals. And it's common for them to feed on carcasses like this, where a lead bullet passes through and leaves behind tiny little pieces of lead. And they're just being exposed to lead over and over and over again. In fact, we've recorded over 80 deaths since the 1984, which is essentially since the modern program began. Over 80 deaths confirmed from lead poisoning. That's just a huge, huge number when we're talking about such few numbers of individuals in the first place. And we also can be very certain that at least 80%, if not all, is from bullet ingestion. And again, just no other threat pales in comparison. So right around the same time groups were working toward a ban solution, we were thinking about more of a olive branch kind of solution. The law did go into effect, AB 711, which required and still requires the use of non-lead ammunition when taking animals anywhere in the state of California, which is precedent setting, I'll give you that. But the problem is it's extremely hard to enforce. I mentioned earlier, a lot of these birds are foraging on 30,000 acre ranches. How do you enforce people using 22 non-lead ammunition, whether it's 22 or whatever, on big scale ranches like that? It's incredibly difficult. So, we really thought we needed to think out of the box. So we actually started providing free copper ammunition. And I'll go back to my West Virginia roots here, because when I grew up, in West Virginia, I used to joke, there's more deer than there are people. And, it was like a birthright. And I know what it's all about. I have a respect for hunting. I have a respect for a lot of different outdoor activities. And, people who switch to copper ammunition within the range of the condor are making a huge difference for this species. It is the #1 threat. And I am completely convinced that if we can solve this one threat, that condors will once again survive without the help of human caretakers. I mean, they're pretty much doing that already. It's just that the death rate is so high. We were accused of it being just sort of a gimmicky kind of a thing when we started in 2012. And I think by now people are realizing that it's not. We've given away over 10,000 boxes and over $250,000 worth of non-lead ammunition. But it's just the start, and we have a long way to go. If we look at where condors are on the landscape, pretty recent, just as of 2019, this actually was put together by Evan McReith. So it's a heat map. So wherever you see the darker red color, that's where you're going to have more condor activity. But what's really neat is you'll see some of these birds released or wild raised in Central California have traveled all the way to Southern California and up into the Southern Sierras. So these birds can cover hundreds of miles in a day. And I didn't update the graph largely because it is so depressing, but 2020 was our worst year. And we lost 24 condors in 1 year in Central California. This number here is 200, and this is for the entire California population. So we had 101 at the beginning of 2020 in Central California. The other 99 were in Southern. And then just this year, we went from 101, 24 losses. And then we made up some ground with some new releases, but we've never had so many losses in 1 year. Well, the Dolan fire was a big explanation as to why it was such a horrible year. Some, I'll say it, jerk, arsonist, started a wildfire only about 2 or 3 miles away from our Condor sanctuary in Big Sur on August 18th. And we had no time to react. There was nothing we could do. Thankfully, we didn't have any condors in release facilities, but we did have 5 nesting pairs and their chicks in the path of this fire that eventually burned 125,000 acres. It completely destroyed all of our facilities, but what was really more enthralling was we had a live streaming camera at the sanctuary while it was occurring, and even one camera inside of a nest. And I'd like to just show you a couple of quick videos. A lot of people around the world just fell in love with these birds. Kingpin is the male, stub book number 167. That's the adult in this video on your left. And we had not a competition, but a public involvement of naming their chick. And they named the chick Aniko, which is Nigerian, meaning born during troubled times. Well, that decision was made before the Dolan fire. So the name really is apropos. Let me show you the video. Now, the reason why people, I think, fall in love with condors is not because of their looks, but because of how affectionate they are. And when you look at Kingpin, by the way, this is a 24-year-old condor. This condor was as old as our program was. This is a patriarch, almost as old as our program. This is a patriarch of our flock. Let me show you this video. There were other videos where, you know, the chick and Kingpin, the male, especially the male for some reason, even more so than the female, just very affectionate, and lots of videos where their heads and necks were all wrapped around each other and all this kind of stuff. And it's just beautiful to watch. Well, that Dolan fire that started first burned near where Aniko and this nest was located. This was the first nest to experience the Dolan fire. And so the live streaming camera was still in operation. And live streaming camera followers from all over the world were in horror as we had to watch this, which was the final few minutes before the camera cut out. And first off, the difference in the sound is amazing. The first clip, you know, had you know, these sweet sounds of wind blowing and birds chirping or whatever. And then this video clip, all you could hear is the raging fire outside of the nest, you know. The other thing that's quite striking is look at the difference in size between Aniko at that age, only a few weeks of age, to here about 5 and a little more than 5 months of age. So they grow very, very quickly in a short amount of time. But I'm happy to say Aniko did survive the fire. His father, Kingpin, did not, and was one of 10 condors that ultimately lost their lives to this one wildfire event, which before that event, wildfire had only taken the lives of 7 condors in the last 25 years combined. Another reason why this event is, I believe, an anomaly is because the nature of the timing. The fire burned through the sanctuary in the middle of the night, and we had a flock of 20 some birds roosting in the sanctuary at the time the fire burned through. And we believe that most of them survived and somehow managed to fly in the middle of the night, which they don't typically do. Whereas 9 didn't, and then a 10th later died from its injuries. And of course, our facilities were completely destroyed, and we're actively rebuilding now. We hope to have the big sanctuary back up and completely running again by summer 2022. And thankfully, we do have another release site, which is only about 50 miles to the south, which is also a coastal release site. So we're continuing to release there. But you can see, this photo on the right, this on the neck area of this condor, this is actually a giant scab. So this is a bird that survived the fire, presumably, but was burned and then recovered on its own. We brought in 3 or 4 birds from the wild to Los Angeles Zoo for treatment, all having burn injuries, and one of them did not make it. So that made the 10th loss. But lead was at least as big of a problem this year. We still have some results pending, but we had probably an equal amount of deaths caused by lead poisoning just this one year. And it really spiked this year. Last year, it was only a handful of birds, and it was really looking very, very encouraging. But this year, manufacturing slowed, just came to a halt practically. And there's a big demand for ammunition. So most people can't buy copper ammunition if they want to. So it doesn't take rocket science to understand why lead poisoning is continuing to be an ongoing problem here in Central California. I'm hopeful that the market's going to turn around and at least get back to what it was last year, which seemed to be going in the right direction. So hopefully after COVID, things will turn around on that front. But that's what we're dealing with as of this year. So I mentioned Aniko, the condor chick, survived, as well as 90% of the flock. So we have to keep it positive. But imagine losing 10% of your population all in one fell swoop. I mean, it was a tough pill to swallow. Oh, and this photo here is actually the nest tree that Aniko was in. This is where the camera is located. And you can see the trunk is really badly damaged, but it's still standing. So maybe they'll continue to use it. Side story here. After the male, which was named Kingpin, died, he was no longer in the picture. Aniko still had about a month to go before fledging. And in that time, some other male, about a 7-year-old male, who apparently was eyeing that territory, thought it would be a good idea to attack Aniko and flush Aniko out of the nest. And this was all happening on streaming camera also. Thankfully, Aniko was not hurt. It was more of a show of dominance than it was, anything else. But Aniko was on the ground. That's this chick here. And so we went ahead and rescued the chick, and it is now at Los Angeles Zoo and will be re-released next year. So boy, if that one bird could tell the story from, cam viewers to Dolan fire to losing his father, and this the whole thing is pretty incredible. So right now I mentioned rebuilding is our main focus, and a lot of what we're doing right now is just trying to make the site safe again. Every one of these little dots represents a hazard tree, and this being one of those dots. Big 30-inch in diameter ponderosa pine trees that could just come down at any time. So it's not safe. We need to clear all that out. So it's just a big mess right now, but we're getting through it. And we're getting through it because we can continue to do our work, and that's what it's really all about. This year, we were able to release 9 condors from captivity, 7 from San Diego, and another 2 that were slated to go to Baja, but unfortunately couldn't be released there. So we released all 9 of those in San Simeon, and so far, I'm knocking on wood, all 9 of those are doing well. So as I mentioned, despite the threats, I'm really optimistic. I think we're on the right track. We've been at this for over 20 years. I'll grant you that. And we still have a ways to go. But what I'm mostly excited about when I go to work every day is when I think that this species, despite Dr. Samuels and others' beliefs that maybe it was too far gone, that we can recover this species once again, that it is possible for a species like this to survive on its own. I think that in itself is worth the effort every day. And the other reason too, I know people, they don't contribute or they don't care about condors because of their looks. I mean, I've even had people send me a check and say, "Oh my gosh, Kelly, I can't believe I'm donating to these ugly birds. I mean, oh my gosh," right? And they go on and on and on. But then they say, "But I love them." And that's because they're so social. I think people do fall in love with these birds because they see just how social they are and how intimate they are when they're raising their young. And it just sort of, you just can't help but kind of personify these birds a little bit and get attached. So, to me, those are the 2 main reasons of why this is worthwhile, because it is possible. They've had everything thrown at them except the kitchen sink, and yet here they are. They're still here today, and I think they'll persist if we give them a chance. So lastly, just want to throw out a couple of ways you can stay involved. We have Condor Zoom chats on the last Thursday of the month, and our Condor field crew, gets to tell the stories of all the birds and who's mating with who. And we have these interesting trio situations where we have 2 males and 1 female and 2 females and 1 male. And so it just makes for real fun gossip. Good Condor soap opera material. Of course, our social media and our website. And in the next few years, I think you'll really see big improvement on our website and more video-based content to couple with the live streaming cameras, which you can access there. And if you're so inclined, we even have an online auction this fall. But anyway, I just want to end with that and see if you have any questions. And I'll go ahead and stop my screen share. And are we going to do questions live or in the chat? How do you want to do that, Hannah?
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, feel free to let me know in the chat. I can unmute you, or I can just read your question.
Well, I see Katie wrote that her daughter, who's 8, wants to be a condor biologist when she grows up. Well, I can tell you a few things. After COVID allows, she can come out and go on our Condor Wilderness Camp. And then when she's a little older, typically right after college is when we recruit people to do an internship. And then, of course, we have full-time paid biologist positions too. But, there's more and more opportunities these days. When I was entering the workforce, it was a lot more bleak. I remember a lot of my close friends and family saying, well, how are you going to make a living? And I think there's more opportunities now. I see a question about carcasses. I'd love to answer that one. That's from Mike Bergen. So yeah, we do put carcasses out for the condors because number one, when they're young and they're first released, they don't know where to go and they're naive, just like at any other hack site, whether you're releasing peregrine falcons, you have to put food out. It used to be quail in my day, or bald eagles. We would put out fish, whole fish, and we would do that for a matter of 2 or 3 months before the youngsters were able to take off on their own. Well, similarly, condors also need food when they're young for an extended period of time. And because of that lead problem, we continue to put the food out because they're stillborn calves. So we know they're not containing lead. And we know that if they get that meal, at least that's a meal that's not going to kill them. I mean, that's how critical this lead poisoning problem is. And we look forward to the day when we don't put carcasses out anymore. And I think a lot of people, they see that we put carcasses out there and they automatically assume, oh, the birds need it or something like that, but they have to realize it's all stemming back to the lead problem. I think if we didn't have the lead problem, we'd probably put food out for a few months after the youngsters are released, and after they're on their own, we'd probably stop feeding until the next release. But because of lead problem, we feed year round.
I think one of the first questions was, what's a single bird's range?
Oh, yeah. Well, with these GPS tags, we've learned a tremendous amount. And we know that when they're young and unpaired, they tend to make bigger movements, call them foraging forays or exploratory flights. Sometimes, actually last year, I'm remembering we had a bird fly. I think it was a total of 343 miles in like 2.5 days or something like that. So it's a huge, huge area. Now, when they get to be breeding age, it tends to be more, smaller in size. But even the home range of a breeding pair could be, 50 square miles or something like that. So, they're those 9.5 wings are there for a reason, so that they can get up in these thermals and fly, huge distances, because they just don't know where that next meal is going to come from.
And how old is the oldest condor that you've worked with?
Well, Kingpin was our oldest. He died at 24. I know in captivity, Topa was the first condor brought into captivity. He was a little fledgling, less than a year old in the 60s. So I think he's over 50 already. He's still actively breeding in captivity. And I know Andean condors in the London Zoo live to be 70 and 72. So, we don't really know how old they can live, kind of getting at your question. But that's why I say at least 50 years.
Cool. And then Vicky's question is, do you have less threat of lead poisoning for the group that's away from the ranches and on the coast eating whales?
Great question. And one time we even thought that maybe we could somehow encourage the birds to stay more on the coast, and of course you can't do that because they go where they want to go and they go where the food is. And so they go inland all the time. And so that actually coupled with our logic of, okay, we can't beat them. We got to join them. We got to start handing out free ammunition because we can't hide from it. But yes, we did see lower lead levels in the early years before the two subflocks started mixing. Once they started mixing and the birds realized how easy it was to fly back and forth, then it just all kind of blended into one.
And then Nolan, who is 13, asks, what is the mortality rate of the condors that get released?
That's an excellent question. I can answer it this way. If we look at that in terms of a population level, population viability, because we're working on an analysis of PVA right now, we would say that they are not yet viable. That the mortality rate is just still a little too high. The survivorship's just not quite high enough to support the population growing on their own. Another way I could answer that, in the 1980s, when the tough decision was being made to bring in the entire flock, the wild flock at that time was dying. Each individual had a 25% chance of dying each year. So imagine 25% mortality rate, 1/4 of everyone is gone 1 year to the next. I mean, I can't stress it enough. I mean, these are tough birds. They can withstand a lot, but nothing can withstand 25% mortality per year.
And then Bill has a question. Do you do chelation? I hope I pronounced that right, on the condors to remove lead?
Oh yeah, yeah, and even sometimes really, the zoos will even undergo surgery if they can't get the metal out. They'll do surgery. Before that, they'll try things like Metamucil to try to get the projectile out of their system. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, by the time we get our hands on them, they're so far gone. Their digestive system is paralyzed. There's nothing moving through their system, and they have hours, maybe days to live. It's a very, very difficult disease to catch early, especially when the condors are flying around on this giant landscape of ours, not wanting to be recaptured. Oh, and on top of that, unfortunately, the technology that we have to use for screening lead in the field is very limited. We can only go up to 0.65 parts per million, and we've had lead poisoning cases go like 7 and 8 parts per million. So just the techniques don't really support field treatments. It's just a real tough situation out there.
And then I have a question from Autumn, who is an aspiring ornithologist studying at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. She wants to know, can you briefly share how you got to this point in your career, specifically from college?
Yeah, I think I shared a little bit about that in my presentation because of the audience. I'm a proud West Virginian, and when I grew up there, I spent most of my time running around in the woods and falling in love with animals. In particular, I remember finding a red-tailed hawk nest that I went and I studied every day I could and told everyone that I could about it. And then that's when I found out about the West Virginia Raptor Rehabilitation Center, and I started volunteering. And that's really the first leg up that I was given. And then while I was in college, I put together this bald eagle monitoring effort with volunteers for the state of West Virginia. And then so you just, I think the most important thing is to volunteer and get involved with groups and follow your passion, build up your resume with as much volunteerism as you can, because eventually you'll get that full-time job offer. But you just have to put your dues in.
And then this is also a question that I had, but someone else had it. Have you had much difficulty with genetic inbreeding with the relatively small population?
Yeah, thankfully not. We have not seen anything out of the ordinary. There's something called egg dystrophy chondrostrophy. Anyway, it's egg dwarfism is the common name. And it's a fairly common genetic abnormality in turkeys, I guess, a long time ago before it was bred out of them. It's kind of a widespread abnormality in a lot of avian species. So we haven't seen anything other than that. And reproductively, they're doing incredibly well now because we've almost bred that out of the species as well, since we know, we pretty much have a really good idea, you know, which birds are carrying that recessive gene, and so therefore we can kind of keep them apart in the zoos. So we help manage that. And we haven't, yeah, like I said, we haven't had any other problems. So again, I'll knock on wood, but genetics nor habitat have really been a big issue for us.
And then Laura wants to know, how long did it take to catch the condors to bring them into captivity, and how did they do that?
So I wasn't around then. I can't speak directly from experience. I mean, I'm an old guy, but I'm not quite that old. But I know some of the people who were involved in that, you know, like Pete Bloom and Dave Clendenin, and people that I have a lot of respect for. They were out there catching these birds. Believe it or not, Pete Bloom used to try to catch these birds by hand using an old Native American technique where you dig a hole and you literally lie in wait in the ground in a hole with the little, you know, where your arms can reach out and grab the legs of the condor as it's feeding on a carcass. And that actually worked. They captured a few of the wild condors that way. Dave Clendenin, and the technique he used was a cannon net. And, you know, you can imagine this big giant net, you know, being launched with projectiles. Not exactly a good thing to do nowadays with fire hazard. But back then, you know, that was the way they did it. And that's how they brought them all into captivity. And no one wanted to. I think, you know, there was a huge controversy about that. A lot of people felt like they should just be let go, you know, let them go away in dignity. You know, I remember people saying that. And others felt like, you know what, there must be something going on here. There's some mortality threat or something going on. We need to figure it out. And so here we are.
Cool. And then, Bill, do you want me to unmute you to make your comment, or do you want me to just read it? Okay, I can just read it. So he said, thanks. He traveled with you down Big Sur and saw 27 condors feeding on a whale carcass in 2012. And that was great. So that's cool.
I knew you looked familiar, Bill.
Does anyone have any other questions that they want to put in the chat?
There were 3 of us that went with you on that trip down to see the whales, the whale carcass with 27 different condors. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's a rare day to see that many all at once.
Yeah, sure was.
Well, okay. Well, thanks again for having me. It was a real pleasure to put this together and see all of you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. That was awesome. So I really appreciate it.